Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here again. It's wonderful to be able to gather for a seminar that I am particularly looking forward to today. It's the fourth of our series of seminars this semester on the state of nature idea. We've heard from Alan Levinovitz, Mark Somos, and Sarah Winter so far. And today I'm delighted to be able to welcome to the Social Contract Research Seminar Professor Christopher Kelly of Boston College. I'm particularly excited because Professor Kelly's article, Rousseau's Peut-être, Reflections on the Status of the State of Nature, has been really instrumental for me in my own understanding of the different ways in which the state of nature motif can work and functions, the complex ways in which it functions in Rousseau's text. And so I'm personally very grateful to him for that article and his work on Rousseau, and delighted to be able to hear more about that today. Christopher Kelly is professor in the political science faculty at Boston College. He's co-editor of the collected writings of Rousseau with Roger D. Masters, and also co-editor of The Challenge of Rousseau with Eve Grace. He's the author of Rousseau's Exemplary Life and Rousseau as an Author. He teaches courses in political theory, focusing on early and late modern political thought. And today, he's going to speak to the title Rousseau's States of Nature. So please do join me in welcoming Christopher Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very glad to be here. As you say, my topic is Rousseau's States of Nature. So I'm going to do, generally speaking, two things. One, give an account of the different states of nature that one sees in the Second Discourse, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, with some reference to other texts. And then also focus in particular on the particular state of nature that Rousseau refers to by numerous names that I'll list in the first part of the Second Discourse. The shortcut name I'll be using for it most of the time is the pure state of nature. And in that part of the second part of my talk, I'm going to be making one particular claim about the account that he gives of the pure state of nature, which is this, that for any reader of the Second Discourse, there are a number of terms that Rousseau uses in a somewhat technical way, pure state of nature being one of them. Another one being perfectibility, a term which he may even have invented. He certainly was the first person ever to use it in print in French. And then also natural goodness, which he repeatedly in many works says is the key notion of his system. And what I'm going to be arguing is that, in effect, those three terms, pure state of nature, perfectibility, and natural goodness, are so indistinguishable as to be virtually identical. You can't understand one of them properly without understanding the other two properly. Each one entails the others. That's the preview of my conclusion. But let me start with the passage which I think is at the center of most of the scholarly disagreements about Rousseau's understanding of the state of nature. And that comes in the preface of the Second Discourse, in which Rousseau is describing his enterprise. And he says, others will easily be able to go farther on the same road, though it will not be easy for anyone to reach the end of it. For it is no light undertaking to separate what is original from what is artificial of the present nature of man, and to know correctly a state which no longer exists, which perhaps never existed, which probably never will exist, and about which it is nevertheless necessary to have precise notions in order to judge our present state correctly. This is a statement I'll be coming back to with some frequency, And let me repeat again what I think are the key parts of this. To know correctly a state which no longer exists, which perhaps never existed, which probably never will exist. So those are the three conditions for it. And they certainly make his statement seem very mysterious. How could he talk about something that probably never will exist, probably never did exist, certainly doesn't exist, and probably never will exist? This becomes all the more confusing when we consider the different accounts of the state of nature, or different stages or versions of the state of nature that are given, particularly in the second part of the discourse. So let me go through some of these. In the first place, we have accounts given in the second part of the second discourse of versions of the state of nature that do in fact exist now. So we can't say they perhaps never existed. They certainly do exist, and in every likelihood, they will continue to exist. There are essentially two of these. The first is a condition which he sometimes also calls nascent society. And nascent society is a condition in which, while there's no private property, no laws, and no government, there's certainly an organized society that is controlled by customs. There's a degree of inequality. There's certainly language. There's a social life. And yet, this is a part of the state of nature. And Rousseau says this is precisely the point reached by most of the savage peoples known to us. And it is for want of having sufficiently distinguished between ideas, and notice how far these peoples already were from the first state of nature, that many have hastened to conclude that man is naturally cruel, that he needs civilization in order to make him gentle. So we have a state of nature that exists that is distant from the first state of nature. And this is a condition which European travelers, as they discover new lands, find many people belonging to. So there is a state of nature which does in fact exist now. That's point number one. There's a second state of nature that exists now, and that's the condition of international relations. He says later in part 2, the body's politic, thus remaining in the state of nature with relation to each other, soon experienced the inconveniences that had forced individuals to leave it. And among these great bodies, that state became even more fatal than it had previously been among the individuals of whom they were composed. He, in fact, says more murders were committed on a single day of fighting, and more horrors in the capture of a single city than were committed in the state of nature during whole centuries over the entire face of the earth. So this is a state of nature that exists among states. And one of the parts that's distinctive of Rousseau's certainly not at all distinctive to say that international relations is a state of nature. What he does insist is that it's a much worse state of nature than everything that existed before. More people are killed in one day of battle than would have been killed in centuries before there were organized states. This is the thought he develops in a fragmentary work called On the State of War, which for a long time was just considered to be a collection of disconnected fragments until Grace Roosevelt saw the manuscripts and realized that they were simply folded the wrong way and put in the wrong order. She shuffled them, and it turned into a coherent manuscript. There's been a little bit of tinkering with the manuscript since then, but it's about a 15-page fragmentary, unfinished work, but it's a coherent work. And it is account of the way in which the international system forms a state of nature which is particularly bloody and much worse than anything before there were organized states. So again, There are two examples of states of nature that do exist. The state of savage peoples being discovered by Europeans, which is a vanishing state, but still existing state in some places. And then secondly, the international relations. So for the first statement, doesn't exist, that does not apply to these versions of the state of nature. Secondly, did exist. Rousseau says that in the statement that I read, that the state that we need to describe is one that may never, perhaps never existed, but there is a state of nature which he says did definitely exist. First of all, the state of savage human beings is one that existed in the past for everyone, but he also refers at the very beginning of the second part of the discourse to a scene in which he talks about the origin of private property. He says, the first person who, having fenced off a plot of ground, took it into his head to say, this is mine, and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. But he immediately says, there was a long period of preparation for this event. Private property in land couldn't simply spring into existence from nowhere. So he then calls this, he says, it was necessary to make much progress, to acquire much industry and enlightenment, and to transmit and augment them from age to age before arriving at this last limit of the state of nature. So we have a period that's the last limit of the state of nature. In this last limit is a state that Rousseau claims did in fact exist. There was a point in which human beings lived without private property rights in land. This is the last limit of the state of nature because the establishment of property rights and laws to delimit the property rights and governments to enforce the property rights are all the departure from the state of nature. But there is a last limit, and this is a limit that did in fact exist. So we have states of nature that do exist, states of nature that did exist but don't anymore. And then finally, there's a state of nature that will exist. The situation that is not the situation we are in the moment, but it's the situation we're on the verge of. And this he describes at the end of the discourse. He talks about governments turning into despotisms, the tendency that he sees going around him. Every one of Rousseau's works, every one of his major works of political thought carries in it a prediction that a revolution is coming that's going to destroy the monarchies and indeed the republics of Europe, and that there will be an age of despotisms before there is something else, and we don't know what that will be. And here in the discourse, he says, here is the last stage of inequality and the extreme point which closes the circle and touches the point from which we started. Here, all individuals become equals again because they are nothing, and subjects no longer having any law except the will of the master, or the master any other rule except his passions. The notions of good and the principles of justice vanish once again. Here, everything is brought back to the sole law of the stronger, and consequently to a new state of nature, different from the one with which we began, in that the one was the state of nature in its purity, and this last is the fruit of an excess of corruption. So we have the new state of nature, which is Rousseau's prediction for the fairly near future, at least in France and possibly in Europe as a whole. So again, it appears that the statement that Rousseau made at the beginning of the work has many exceptions to it, all of which really occur in part two. So the question then is, what is he talking about when he says it's a state that perhaps never existed, certainly doesn't exist now, and probably never will exist again? And Now I'm going to go through the list of terms that he uses to describe this state. I know, first of all, that he calls it a state that we need to have knowledge of. It's, I think, necessary to assume that by this he means the state of nature in some form, but he does just call it a state. One other thing I'll mention is that there is a peculiarity in the discourse in the way in which Rousseau refers to the state of nature, and that concerns his use of capital letters. Generally, it's small s state, capital N nature, but not always. Sometimes both are capitalized. We don't know whether this was Rousseau's intention. We don't have the manuscript that he sent to the publisher, which we do have in other cases. So we know the book appeared this way. It could be a copy editor's decision. Who knows? But Rousseau did take his copy and mark it up and make changes, added new notes, and so on. He didn't change the capitalization. Maybe he just decided it would be too much trouble to do. Maybe he didn't notice what the copy editor had done, but maybe it was done on purpose. I'm going to give one example in which I think it has some significance. But let me list off the different ways in which he refers to the state of nature in part one. First, he refers sometimes to what he calls the genuine state of nature. The genuine state of nature isn't distinguished from the states of nature in part two that I've described already. The genuine state of nature is distinguished from what our writers attribute to the state of nature. Rousseau insists that all writers on politics have seen a need to go back to the state of nature. None of them has reached it. And he attributes this to our writers, to the philosophers, specifically to Hobbes, to Cumberland, and by implication, Montesquieu. So everyone saw the problem that he sees, and they all got it wrong. So the genuine state of nature is as opposed to what our writers say the state of nature is. It's not as opposed to nascent society, a state of nature, the state of war among states, a state of nature, and so on. So genuine state of nature. He also uses the term primitive state when talking about this condition in part one of the discourse. He also uses the term primitive condition. He also uses the term original state. He uses the term, which was in one of the remarks that I cited earlier, first state of nature. Most significantly, in my opinion, he uses the term pure state of nature. And in one case, state of nature, its purity. And here I want to make a little aside. One can find in secondary literature on Rousseau, particularly in French, a number of scholars who talk about Rousseau's idea of the state of pure nature. The state of pure nature is a term that Rousseau never uses anywhere. I believe it. Not in his correspondence, not in any of his published works, not in any of his notes. State of pure nature is a term that Voltaire uses once in a while. And it can certainly be traced back to medieval thinkers who talk about a state of pure nature as being something like the state of human beings before the fall, sinless nature. So it's in that account, nature that is pure. Rousseau is talking more of the state, the state of nature, the condition is pure. It's not that when scholars attribute to him this idea of pure nature, I think they attribute to him a romanticized or idealized notion of nature, which is completely absent in Rousseau. So it's a pure condition. It's not that nature is pure in it. For example, he makes it very clear that in the pure state of nature, there's an extremely high infant mortality rate. That people, when they encounter each other and need food, will push an old man down and take his food away from him, and so on. They're not nice people, right? And it's not a nice condition. It's a pure condition in a way, but it's not that human nature is pure as opposed to being impure. There is one case late in the discourse in which he uses the term state of nature in its purity. And that has some ambiguity, I think you could say, between whether he's saying that it's nature in its purity or whether it's the state of nature in its purity. This is one of the rare cases in which the word state in state of nature is capitalized. I suspect that's to attach the purity to the state rather than to nature as a term. I don't think I can prove that, but I suspect that that's true. So in any case, pure state of nature. And that's the term I'm going to be using to describe what he also calls the genuine state of nature. I choose it in part because I think it's helpful, also because the other terms, primitive, original, or first, to varying degrees, give a very strong idea of this as being a condition that actually existed. Original certainly seems to sound like it was something that existed. First sounds like something that existed. Primitive, less clearly so. But I do think that in order to take seriously his statement that this is something that perhaps never existed, pure is the useful term. But we can't forget his use of the other terms. He certainly gives the impression at times that he's talking about a condition that did exist. So now I'm going to enter into the second part of my remarks, the description of the pure state of nature and its relation to these key notions of perfectibility and natural goodness. And I want to begin by talking, perhaps unnecessary, I'm sure it's unnecessary for some of you who are well acquainted with Rousseau's scholarship, and perhaps will be dull for those of you who aren't, but I want to situate the way in which people interpret this statement about a state which perhaps never existed. Now, in Rousseau's scholarship, on every issue, there is immense disagreement. You can find people who will defend almost any position about Rousseau, and particularly on the pure state of nature. This is true. In spite of the disagreements, or within most of these disagreements, almost all scholars have attempted to solve the puzzle posed by Rousseau's statement, the state of nature perhaps never existed, either tacitly assuming or explicitly claiming that Rousseau does not mean what he says. When he says perhaps never existed, that isn't what he means. Right? How can that be? Some, struck by the oddity of the account of the state of nature that follows, and the apparent implausibility of the account of the state of nature that follows, insist that Rousseau really meant that the state of nature, in fact, never existed, and that it perhaps simply confuses the issue. According to this view, his account is not intended as in any sense historical. Rather, it's a sort of hypothetical construct illustrating two principles of the soul that he identifies at the beginning of the discourse. According to this view, not only did the state of nature not ever exist, in principle, it never could have, any more than a hypothetical frictionless surface could exist in physics. We can talk about frictionless surfaces as a hypothesis, to deduce certain laws and so on, but we know there aren't any frictionless surfaces. So there was no pure state of nature. So in addition, therefore, when Rousseau adds that it probably never will exist, he actually meant, or at least should have said, that it certainly never will exist. So he shouldn't have said perhaps, and he shouldn't have said probably. Is that the? I think those people necessarily say that Rousseau is incapable of expressing himself clearly. A second group of interpreters, struck by the radically anti-Edenic character of Rousseau's account, to which he explicitly calls attention, insists that he really meant that the state of nature did exist, but that he added the perhaps out of caution to avoid offending ecclesiastical authorities too much. Right? So perhaps gives him a sort of hinge. There's a third sort of interpretation, which argues that Rousseau meant the pure state of nature neither as a factual condition, nor as a hypothetical construct, but as a fiction or a myth, a rhetorical device meant to inspire nostalgia for something that never existed, and therefore to distance us from our present condition. Now, I think all of these interpretations can point to additional evidence in the text that support them. They agree only in insisting that intentionally or unintentionally, Rousseau did not express himself clearly. They attempt to make his position more plausible by rewriting what he says. I'm going to try to take seriously what Rousseau says and have as my working hypothesis that he was capable of saying what he wanted to say, and that he's fairly open in what he's saying, at least in this case. So to begin with, I would say perhaps one should not be so quick to dismiss Rousseau's perhaps, which seems to imply that contrary to the first and third set of interpretations, the hypothetical construct and the myth, that the state of nature is a possible condition. Perhaps existed means it could have existed, but didn't necessarily exist. And it's not simply an abstract concept or a fiction, but also contrary to the second set of interpretations, that it might not actually have existed. So in other words, I take the perhaps very precisely, I think. What could this mean? To grasp this, it is important to consider some other discussions Rousseau gives, both inside the discourse and outside the discourse. I'll mention, first of all, a passage from the Confessions in which he talks about what he did in writing the discourse. He says that after writing his first discourse in a series of responses to critics and other works, he started exposing his principles more clearly. And then he says, I soon had an occasion to develop them completely in a work of the greatest importance, that being the Second Discourse. I made a clean sweep of the petty falsehoods of men. I dared to strip naked their nature, to follow the progress of time and things that have disfigured it, and comparing the man of man with the natural man to show them the genuine source of his miseries and his pretended perfection. So the key term I want to call to your attention in this is follow the progress of time and things. To say it's a historical account is following the progress of time, but following the progress of things is a little bit harder to understand. And I want to look a little bit at what Rousseau says about things in the discourse itself. In the discourse, even prior to introducing the technical term state of nature, Rousseau raises the general problem of seeing man as nature formed him, through all the changes with the succession of times and things must have wrought in his original constitution. So time and things again. He uses an image which was earlier employed by both Plato and Ovid to illustrate his point, referring to the statue of Glaucus, which is underwater, in which time, sea, and storms had so disfigured. So this is, our nature is like this statue, which has been disfigured by time, sea, and storms. The image stresses the disfiguration of the statue by natural causes external to itself, rather than from an internal process of development. The sea and storms represent the things that operated on human nature over time, disfiguring it. Later, when defending the discourse against a critic in his letter to Philopolis, Rousseau compared his account of the development of societies with decrepitude in an individual, which is, of course, a result of an internal development. We age by an internal development. But Rousseau, having made this parallel, shows the imperfection of the parallel by adding, the entire difference is the state of old age is derived from the nature of the human race, not immediately, as you say, but only as I have proved with the help of certain external circumstances that may or may not happen, or at least occur sooner or later. So his opponent has taken the view that the current state of society is the natural maturation of the human species. You could say history was aiming at human beings living in Paris. And Rousseau says that that's an accidental result. It occurred with the help of certain external circumstances that may or may not happen, or at least occur sooner or later. In other words, the disfigurement that takes place over time is accidental in the sense that it is not a necessary, intrinsic consequence of human nature. At the very least, it could have been postponed indefinitely. In this respect, it's unlike old age. We wish we could postpone old age indefinitely, but it comes about by an organic necessity. Social developments don't work the same way. Similarly, in Emile, Rousseau says that education comes from three factors: nature, man, and things. By nature, he means, he says, the internal development of our faculties and our organs. By things, he means what we acquire from our own experience about the objects which affect us. So things are objects external to us. This distinction between nature and things is the same as the distinction between nature and external circumstances in the letter to Philopolis that I was just talking about, and the distinction between nature and the succession of times and things that introduces the Glaucus image. What Rousseau asserts in the discourse, then, is the crucial influence of environmental factors exterior to human nature acting over time, the equivalent of the succession of times and things, over the way the human condition develops. To be sure, earlier thinkers, such as Montesquieu or even Aristotle, paid attention to the fact that humans interact with their natural environment, but none of them attribute the same importance that Rousseau does to this interaction. Indeed, he asserts that this interaction is at the center of what it means to be human. Humans interact with things outside of them in ways that are different from other species. The fact that only causes exterior to human nature take men out of the pure state of nature means that the possibility of the existence of this state depends on these causes. There's certainly has in fact been a development of human faculties over time. Rousseau could hardly deny that. But did an exterior environment ever exist that did not change humans from the beginning and that preserved them in a natural condition? Was there a condition in which things existed but did not change? How durable would such a state have been? On the one hand, as portrayed in part one of the discourse, it seems extraordinarily durable in that human nature has nothing internal to it that will cause it to change. What could be more durable than our nature? This is summarized at the end of part one, where Rousseau says that the potential faculties of natural man could never develop by themselves, that in order to develop, they needed the chance contribution of several foreign causes, which might never have arisen, and without which he would have remained eternally in his primitive condition. This leaves the impression of eternal durability. A move away from the pure state of nature would have been radically accidental, a fatal accident. But this account, this impression of eternal durability, does not answer the question of when these foreign causes did in fact arise or how avoidable they were. On the other hand, as portrayed in part two, the state of nature, pure state of nature, is fragile in that over the long run, accidents of time and things necessarily cause extreme pressure to change. In fact, after a 2-paragraph summary of part one, Rousseau begins the argument of part two by saying that difficulties soon arose. In part one, it seems eternal. In part two, soon were difficulties. These difficulties involve small things, the height of trees that have to be climbed to get the fruit, but also large things such as variations in terrain, climate, season, and catastrophic accidents such as volcanic eruptions and fires caused by lightning. Rousseau's position seems then to be that whether the pure state of nature existed for an indefinitely long time or for less than an instant depends on these accidents of time and things. If it existed for a long time, this is only because no natural cataclysms of the sort described in part two occurred to destroy it. Not that there weren't natural cataclysms. This is a subject that Rousseau discusses in his dispute with Voltaire over the Lisbon earthquake. Voltaire says, the fact that an earthquake and tidal wave could occur that killed so many people shows that there is no divine providence. Rousseau says the fact that such an earthquake occurred and tidal wave occurred that destroyed so many people shows that people shouldn't build large cities on the coast in an earthquake zone, right? It's not, there can be cataclysms in deserts with a few people living, and they move on quickly with no trouble. So there can be natural cataclysms, but not natural cataclysms that affect human beings. However, it's not entirely impossible that this disruption of human nature by external accidents didn't exist from the very beginning, that human beings were always involved in an interaction with the environment that caused them to change. In other words, when Rousseau says that perhaps the pure state of nature never existed, he is expressing his position perfectly accurately. It could happen in the right natural conditions, but we don't know whether those natural conditions existed. His last word seems clearly to be that it's that the possibility that it never existed, that it didn't exist, is the greater probability. But even if the former is true, his explanation of both the durability and the fragility of the state of nature remains valid. It's durable when considered in itself, but it's fragile when considered in relation to the external world. I can illustrate this point by something that Rousseau says in the essay on the origin of languages, a work which began, he says, as a portion of a draft of the discourse, although it wasn't finished until several years afterward. There, Rousseau says that it is possible to imagine a perpetual spring on Earth in which humans would lead a dispersed, indolent life. This assumption, however, would require that the axis of the Earth not be tilted in relation to the orbit around the sun. Once it's tilted, there will be seasons, and the action of seasons will change things. So Rousseau says, he who willed that man be sociable touched his finger to the axis of the globe and inclined it at an angle to the axis of the universe. In short, sociability is not natural to men in the sense of being part of their internal development. They don't become sociable by themselves. They are made to be sociable through circumstances that did occur, but might not have occurred. The Earth might very well have not had a tilted axis. When did the inclination of the Earth take place? Perhaps it was always there. But if so, it remains the inclination of the axis of the Earth, not human nature, that caused men to become sociable. Or, to put it better, the interaction between the nature of man and the inclination of the axis of the Earth. This is why the essay is consistent with the discourse, even though it contains no hint of anything like the pure state of nature. The fact that Rousseau makes his point about the becoming sociable of humans by referring to events such as earthquakes, floods, or volcanic eruption, as well as the inclination of the axis of the Earth, stresses the accidental character of this development. Nevertheless, as the reference to the height of trees at the beginning of the second part makes clear, these catastrophic accidents are by no means necessary to his argument. He insists upon the surprising power of very trivial causes when they act without interruption. Still, these are trivial causes outside of our nature that act upon our nature. Both time and things are important. Indeed, the same perspective is offered in the second part of the discourse, where Rousseau discusses what he calls nascent society, one of the periods or ages of the state of nature, not the pure state of nature. This condition, which is social, while still remaining in the state of nature in the technical sense of lacking in government of laws, represents as much of a replacement for as a development from the pure state of nature described in part one. It cannot be called purely natural because it is a condition in which the external environment has had a transforming effect on human existence for a long time. In this condition, nations are formed by the influence of climate, he says, which varies from place to place. Nevertheless, it is this condition and not the pure state of nature that he calls the happiest and most durable epoch. Rousseau summarizes his description by saying, the more one thinks about it, the more one finds that this state was the least subject to revolutions, the best for man, that he must have come out of it only by some fatal accident, which for the common utility ought never to have happened. This is the state that he calls the genuine youth of the world, the veritable youth of the world. What does that mean? I suggest that it means that something like that state of human beings divided into, anthropologists might call hunter-gatherer societies, is the original state of nature, but it is not the pure state of nature. It's certainly the most durable, Rousseau claims, more durable than the pure state of nature, certainly. So the significance of his formulation of nascent society as being the veritable youth of the world is indicated by Rousseau's account of its decline, which is caused by the revolution brought about by the development of metallurgy and agriculture, a revolution that was caused by some extraordinary circumstance, he says, and not simply by human inventiveness. People don't invent the use of metals and plows and so on out of nothing. They have to observe metals occurring in a natural condition through a volcanic eruption or something like that. In part one, Rousseau used the lack of agricultural implements and knowledge of how to cultivate land as the distinctive marks of the pure state of nature. This earlier passage gives the impression that anything prior to the development of metallurgy and agriculture would qualify as an almost pure state of nature. So, to summarize, Rousseau's description of the pure state of nature is his response to the natural law theorists' reliance on a vague and indemonstrable doctrine of sociability. He states this clearly immediately after his account of the difficulties involved in giving a description of the origin of language. He concludes that from the little care taken by nature to bring men together through mutual needs and to facilitate their use of speech, one at least sees how little it prepared their sociability. His point is less to deny that men have always lived in social situations of one sort or another than it is to insist that environmental factors operating over time rather than human nature are the most important contributors to whatever situation they have lived in. Now I'm going to turn to perfectibility. From this explanation of Rousseau's state of nature doctrine, you can see the significance of one of the most puzzling and distinctive parts of his description. His claim that the faculty of self-perfection or perfectibility, this term that Rousseau seems to have invented, is the very specific and indisputable quality that distinguishes humans from other species. He says that it is this faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, again, circumstances, successively develops all the others. He immediately goes on to speculate that it is this faculty which, by dint of time, draws him out of that original condition in which he would pass tranquil and innocent days. That it is this faculty which brings to flower over the centuries his enlightenment, his errors, his vices, and his virtues, in the long run makes him the tyrant of himself and of nature. This passage appears to attribute to perfectibility an enormous power. It also seems to call into question the account of the state of nature given above, because it relies on a faculty of human nature to explain the development of social life. The faculty of self-perfection is a part of our nature. Nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind that Rousseau says perfectibility does this with the aid of circumstances. Without the aid of circumstances, it can do nothing then. In the following paragraph, he puts this even more restrictively by saying that the human soul will be limited to what it has in common with all animals unless new circumstances cause new developments in it. Perfectibility doesn't do the work by itself. Circumstances are necessary. This seems to indicate that perfectibility is nothing but susceptibility to the influence of circumstances. In this sense, it is passive. It becomes active only when influenced by external factors to which it responds. One does not have to be a Rousseauian to be concerned with environmental issues. But it cannot be denied, I think, that Rousseau's doctrine of perfectibility puts interaction with the environment at the center of the understanding what human nature is. Now, of course, Rousseau is well aware that other species interact with the environment as well. Beavers, for example, create dams, build dams, which then change the environment and make it more hospitable to beavers. But beavers don't do other things. They just build dams. Human beings interact with the environment in different ways, in ways that change the environment in unforeseen ways, which then change human beings, which cause them then to interact with the environment and change it in other unforeseen ways, and so on, indefinitely. Far from being an incidental or anomalous element of the description of the state of nature, I think perfectibility is a necessary complement of Rousseau's description. In fact, it is the meaning of the description. The meaning of the description of the pure state of nature and the perhaps connected to it is that what is specific to humans is a unique ability to be influenced by or respond to environmental influences that are themselves accidental to human nature. For other species, exterior obstacles can either be directly overcome or they cannot. In the latter case, the species dies. For humans, exterior obstacles can trigger perfectibility, thereby changing humans, who in turn change the environment, which then changes humans again. Rousseau's next paragraph gives an explanation of an important part of how perfectibility works. He insists on the interdependence of passion and understanding. Without a desire or fear to push understanding, no one would reason. Desire, fear, and other passions are originally dependent on needs that are quite limited. But reasoning or imagination can expand these passions indefinitely because it gives both the power to satisfy desires and new visions of what can be desired. Thus, it is not human nature as such that is composed of the instated passions that developed reason that we observe around us. These things result from the way the external environment has either supported or thwarted our most basic desires. Once started, this accelerated process is almost without limits. As Rousseau says in a note accompanying this passage on perfectibility, it is first of all a question of providing for the necessary, then for the superfluous, next come delights, then immense wealth, then subjects, then slaves. Perfectibility is a response to an externally caused disruption of the harmony between desire and ability to satisfy desire. Although in principle, it can restore this harmony, this response characteristically increases the disruption by forming a new set of desires along with every advance in knowledge. At the end of part 1, Rousseau summarizes the substance of his argument to this point. He says he has shown that perfectibility, social virtues, and the other faculties that natural men had received in potentiality could never develop by themselves. That in order to develop, they needed the chance combination of several foreign causes which might never have arisen. The issue of when this chance combination of foreign causes began to operate is irrelevant to the core argument. So those like Jacques Derrida, who say that Rousseau's account of the state of nature shows that perfectibility and its consequences must always already have been active in the pure state of nature, are, I think, not demonstrating a contradiction or even a problem in Rousseau's account. Rather, the evidence they put forward shows the meaning and consistency of his argument. Now I'll turn to natural goodness. Consideration of the intimate relation between the state of nature and perfectibility leads to another consequence of the position Rousseau is sketching. It is precisely in the context of his discussion of perfectibility that Rousseau inserts a note announcing that he has demonstrated the natural goodness of man. This is an announcement that comes as a surprise to an attentive reader because Rousseau has not yet made even the slightest reference to this principle, which he later claimed is central to his thought. In fact, there's no reference to this principle in part 1 of the discourse other than in this note. The only other explicit reference in the entire text, as opposed to the note, occurs only a dozen pages after the passage. The note in question here is the paragraph in which perfectibility is introduced as the distinctive human quality, and more specifically, to the sentence that refers to perfectibility as the source of virtues and vices. The note is attached to Rousseau's claim that ultimately man becomes the tyrant of himself and nature. The note not only contains Rousseau's first clear statement about natural goodness, it is also one of the most vivid statements of this principle that he ever provided. It is clear from the location of the note that Rousseau sees the doctrine of natural goodness as the necessary consequence of the idea of perfectibility. If perfectibility is the source of our vices and is what makes us the tyrants of ourself and our nature, it is not us, we are good, not evil by nature. It remains for us to understand what natural goodness means and how it's connected to the doctrine of perfectibility. Rousseau's claim that he has demonstrated that the natural goodness of man occurs in the second paragraph of the note. He prepares for this claim by exposing his disagreement with an opposing claim, namely the view that if one compares the good and evil of human life, one will find that all things considered, life was a rather poor present to man. He's referring to Maupertuis, who gave a sort of calculus of human life, in which he argued that the bad moments of life far outweigh the good. Rousseau does not dispute the observation that is the basis for this view. He not only admits, but insists men are wicked. Sad and constant experience bears the need for proof. Far from being either a refutation or even an opposition to his view, this observation is the indispensable starting point of the analysis that leads to the assertion of natural goodness. The issue is what the source of this wickedness and misery could be. What Rousseau denies is that the undeniable wickedness and misery in which we live is intrinsic to human nature as such. He insists that if one looks for their source, one finds that man has hardly any evils other than those he has given himself. And of course, as we've seen, he has given them to himself only the aid of circumstances. So accidents are necessary for wickedness and misery. As we've seen, or as I've argued so far, perfectibility can be expressed in either active or passive terms. And Rousseau alternates between these depending on the requirements of his rhetoric and the context. In any event, the doctrine of natural goodness is the necessary consequence of the doctrine of perfectibility, just as perfectibility is the necessary complement of Rousseau's account of the state of nature. The three terms are inseparable from each other. The significance of Rousseau's doctrine can be seen by comparing it to the positions he rejects either explicitly or tacitly. The two characteristics of civil men are misery and wickedness. By claiming that the first of these is not natural, Rousseau is attacking a large segment of early modern thinkers who insist upon a dissatisfaction or uneasiness underlying all human experience. Thinkers including Hobbes and Locke, but extending to Maupertuis, Voltaire, and d'Alembert. By claiming that the second, wickedness, is not natural, Rousseau is also denying that sinfulness is an essential part of human nature. As he says in the letter to Beaumont, original sin explains everything except its own principle, and it is this principle that has to be explained. His account to natural goodness and its vulnerability to external forces explains this principle. Perfectibility is the alternative to original sin. It is not human nature as such that causes wickedness and misery. It is the interaction of humans with their environment over time and with accidents does. There's one additional aspect of perfectibility in its relation to natural goodness that requires explanation. That's its relation to virtue, but that's a very long story. The issue of virtue in Rousseau is a very difficult question, and I'm not going to dare to try to explain it here. Perhaps in the discussion afterwards, we can go into that. So I'm going to conclude by summarizing the connections among the state of nature, the pure state of nature, the genuine state of nature, perfectibility, and natural goodness. Rousseau's doctrine of the pure state of nature is nothing but the dramatic depiction of the doctrine of perfectibility. By showing radically asocial humans living in a condition that can be disrupted only by accidents external to human nature, Rousseau is not claiming either that the condition ever existed or that it did not. As he says, perhaps it never existed. What his depiction shows is the importance of the interaction of human nature and these external accidents. This complex interaction exists only because of the distinctive human faculty of perfectibility, a faculty that requires accidents to be activated, but that takes on an extraordinary power once activated. The fact that perfectibility is the ultimate source of both virtues and vices means that naturally humans are good in the sense that in the absence of accidents, they can fulfill their ardent interest in well-being without harming others by necessity. That's my account of the state of nature, or the states of nature, perfectibility, and natural goodness. And I think that's where we're led by taking Rousseau seriously when he uses words like perhaps. That's my account.
Many thanks indeed for that wonderful paper, Christopher. I'm really grateful for the way in which you developed thoughts that with which I was familiar from your earlier article, but took them a lot further. So thank you very much indeed for that. Now, let me just indicate how the rest of this seminar will work. I would love to invite anyone who's got a question or a comment to make, just to write a quick line in the chat to let me know that you'd like to do that. And then I will call upon those in the order that they're added in the chat. I will just start off with a question of my own, if I may, to give people a chance to formulate their own questions and comments. Christopher, you mentioned, as you were introducing the key texts that you dealt with in the talk, that the passage on which critical attention focuses, the perhaps never existed passage, is in the preface to the Second Discourse. And then a lot of the legwork about whether and to what extent various different peoples alive in Rousseau's day are in the state of nature is done in the footnotes. And so there's a preponderance of paratextual material that is at the heart of this debate. And I wonder about the extent to which you think that itself is interesting, because why would Rousseau, if this is so key to what Rousseau is saying, why would he do most of the work for it in the paratextual material around the Second Discourse? And I wonder if one way of reading that preponderance of paratextuality is that he's disrupting or problematizing the very idea of the state of nature. So there's this idea that's been handed down to him from Hobbes and Locke and others of a very strict hierarchy between an undesirable state of nature and a civil society, which is a distinct moment of progress from it. And the quote unquote savage is very inferior to the human being in civil society. But what Rousseau is doing is, rather than just flipping that round, as I think you're very rightly arguing and saying that the state of nature is better, he's saying, no, you can't return to the state of nature. There are, to use your example, old men are still pushed down in order to get food in the state of nature. So it's not some sort of Edenic prelapsarian moment. And in the same way that putting all the stuff in the paratextual material is problematizing the relation between paratext and text, which is controlling the other here, he's also problematizing the nature between the relationship between the state of nature and civil society that's been handed down to him by thinkers like Pufendorf and Hobbes and Locke. Do you think that there's an argument to be made in relation to this paratextuality?
Yes, I do. I mean, as you point out, it's a difficult text even to describe, right? We've got a title page with a picture. We've got even a picture on the title page. The picture refers to a note. We've then got a very long dedicatory letter to Geneva, in which the word state of nature occurs once. The term state of nature occurs once. Then we've got various things before we get to part one, including that preface. And we've also got a note on the notes in which Rousseau tells you, don't read the notes the first time through, but if you have courage enough to read them afterwards. And to say you need courage to read them does suggest that something is at stake in this that would be missed if you don't read them, but that he doesn't expect everyone to. And I think that you're also right that Rousseau is, as your lecture series shows, using a term that is a technical term used by many people over a period of centuries. Rousseau even goes so far as to say everyone who has attempted to describe the foundations of human society refers to the state of nature. But that's not literally true. But Rousseau seems to take it very seriously as a notion which he has inherited. And I think also his claim about the genuine state of nature, as opposed to what our writers say, as you suggest, also shows what's at stake. He is giving an account which he regards as radically different within a framework in which, in the very simplest technical sense, his meaning of the state of nature is the same as everyone else's, right? A condition in which there's no government and laws. In that very formal sense, he means the same thing by state of nature as Hobbes or Locke or the natural law thinkers and so on. So he's taking a notion which is very well established, although with great differences of opinion within it, and he is exploring the weaknesses of all the accounts, I think. And that means he does this on numerous fronts. The paratextuality that you refer to being one of the ways in which he does that.
Thank you very much indeed. Could I please invite Karen to ask her question? Thank you.
Thanks. I found that very interesting. But I was not entirely convinced that you had saved Rousseau from kind of paradox or confusion, in the sense that what you seem to be saying is that Rousseau thinks that, as it were, we might never have come out of the state of nature, since external circumstances are necessary. But given that we clearly did come out of the state of nature, it's presumably something that must have existed and that we were dragged out of by these chance circumstances. So his idea, I mean, if you like, it's a modal kind of fallacy to say that just because something might not have happened, that given that it has happened, that it might still not have happened, if you like. I mean, the future that exists might not, I mean, the present that exists might not might not have been. The present might have been different. We might never have been dragged out of the state of nature. But given, as it were, that there is a claim that somehow there's some part of human nature which is perfectibility, which means that we have the capacity to respond to these sort of accidents. There must have been such accidents which caused us to respond. And so there must have been, as it were, a state of nature, or even on the account that you offered. So I wasn't completely convinced that you'd saved him from kind of confusion.
Okay, I gladly embrace your first formulation that there's a paradox there, but I'm sorry I haven't been able to convince you that there isn't a confusion. Let me try again briefly. When he responds to Philopolis, who says, well, we take our bearings by what has in fact happened. And what has in fact happened is that the world has gone in such a way that people live in places like Geneva, Paris, and London, and Berlin. And of course, we run into people who don't, but we conquer them and they end up living in places like London and Paris and Berlin and so on. And that's what's natural. I think that Philopolis means this, or Charles Bonnet, who uses the name Philopolis, right, lover of the city, who argues that the city is the natural conclusion of human existence. It's natural for human beings to live in modern European cities. I gave a version of this talk in China, and a Chinese scholar raised an objection, something like this, and something like what you said. And I said, so what you're saying is it's natural for human beings to live in places like Beijing. And he didn't want to say that because he didn't like Beijing very much in many ways. So Rousseau is trying to account for, first of all, to deny that, his regular assertion in the discourse is that Europeans tend to measure nature by what is present in Europe, and they're wrong to do so. And he intends to explain the diversity of circumstances in which human beings live, which is rather different from the circumstances in which beavers live, and so on. And then the question is, what explains that diversity? You could explain the diversity by saying there are primitive or backwards people who haven't gotten to the destination yet. Or you could say, as Rousseau does, human beings live in different circumstances because they react to environmental pressures which are different in different places. And there's a sort of open-endedness to the way in which they can react to it. When he says that the accidents need not have happened, he is saying that it's impossible that human beings would have changed without reaction to different environmental pressures, right? He's not claiming that there is a state of nature that continues to exist somewhere. And in fact, I think that his considered position is human beings from the beginning were in interaction with the environment in such a way that their perfectibility was operative. They arrived at a condition still part of the state of nature, but not the pure state of nature, what we might call hunter-gatherers, and stayed there for a very, very long time until certain environmental pressures came along. So I think his actual position is the pure state of nature probably didn't ever exist because there were always external pressures on people that caused them to react to them.
Well, thank you, Christopher. I see that there are 3 questions lined up in the chat, and I would very much like to get through them all if we could. So could I please invite Jennifer to ask your question now?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for taking my question. I've taught this so many times, but always in relationship to Kant, because I'm a Kant specialist, and so I'm coming from that direction. I just wanted to ask you, I guess maybe I'll ask you more a question about the sources that Rousseau has. So he's quoting from Prévost and Buffon and these other sources for travel narratives. And I'm wondering if I just was quickly checking your apparatus and seeing what you were saying about his access to them. Do we have access to his library? Do we know what books he actually was quoting from, or was this secondhand resourcing where he would read somebody and then would attribute it to Kolbe, for example, but he never actually read Kolbe? So, for example, a lot of people talk about the Hottentots. A lot of people cite Kolbe as the source of that information about the Hottentots. Very few people actually read any Kolbe, right? So I'm wondering if you know information about that. Thank you.
Well, you're right to refer to Prévost because the compilation of the travel literature is clearly what Rousseau read in most of the cases, not in all of the cases. But so he read Prévost's collection.
So did he actually, my understanding was that he did have access to Buffon, that he read those volumes. This could be apocryphal, but I thought he had read Buffon with Diderot when visiting him in Vincennes. Is that false? Or
Gee, I don't know about that. He certainly read Buffon. There's no question about that. On your question about access to his library, during the period when Rousseau got the idea for the first discourse, he was working for the Dupin family, doing research for them, and he had access to the Royal Library. And there's lots of literature on what were the books he took out. He took out lots of travel literature. He took out lots of historical literature, and there are the 4,000 pages of notes he took on this stuff, some of which is in France, some of which is at the University of Texas, and some of which turns up regularly on eBay. You could buy the manuscript. So there are thousands of pages of his notes. And certainly in the case of Buffon, he read the Histoire Naturelle essentially volume by volume as it came out. That whether he did it with Diderot, I don't know. Diderot certainly would have read it too. And since when Diderot wasn't in jail, they had lunch together every week until just after the publication of the Second Discourse. They surely would have talked about it, but Rousseau certainly read Buffon. He quotes him, precise quotes frequently. And he has an important quotation from Buffon in a note, I think perhaps the second note to the discourse, about the problem of self-knowledge, which he says that Buffon says our attention is always directed outside. So we're always understanding what we see outside us, the dangers and so on. What we need to do is we also have an internal sense. We need to turn that inside. And Rousseau uses Buffon's authority to show this problem, but then he radicalizes it. And he said, because now when we turn inside, we don't see what's natural. We see deformed, unnatural beings when we look inside ourselves. By acquiring our knowledge, we've made ourselves unnatural. But he uses a quotation from Buffon to start his point.
yeah, and he's
certainly
he's borrowing this notion of domestication as a kind of key to decline and degeneration, and that runs throughout the early volumes of Buffon already.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Could I invite Ioannis, please, to ask the next question?
Chris, thank you very much for this terrific talk. I'm hoping you can hear me even though I'm on the move. I wanted to ask you about the epigraph. So the epigraph refers to Aristotle's Politics and to using an Aristotelian conception of nature as the yardstick by which to assess decay. And so I'm wondering if that hint, in conjunction with the note that you mentioned, where he distinguishes between man and men, so human being in isolation versus human being in society, if you think that there's room for an Aristotelian conception of nature in the state of nature. Thank you.
Yeah, he uses the passage, and it comes from in the context of the discussion of natural slavery in Aristotle. And Aristotle is in Rousseau is certainly concerned to deny the naturalness of slavery. It's a big question, right? To understand the relationship between Rousseau's account of nature and Aristotle's account of nature means one understands Aristotle's account of nature too. And I don't think there is a lot of room for an Aristotelian account of nature in the discourse. Certainly, he relies on a notion of a semi-permanence of species, and so on. But, well, let me put it simply, right? You bring it up in relation to the politics. I would say that the Second Discourse, if I were giving a talk on the Second Discourse, that wasn't on the state of nature, I would say the second discourse is the explanation of what it means to say the opposite of Aristotle. Human beings are not by nature political animals. So I think
what
in
do you
that
make of the
respect,
fact? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What do you make of the fact that that he chooses this epigraph?
yeah, well, I make this that first of all, he agrees with Aristotle about the importance of looking for the natural in the best examples, but he disagrees about what the best examples are. He's very willing to. I'll give two other examples of cases in which he creates an expectation that he then turns on its head. One is the use of the term perfectibility. I mean, since Rousseau is the first person to use it in print, he clearly made a conscious choice that that was a word that would be useful to him. And perfectibility sounds like it's something good. But Rousseau says in his description in the Confessions, it was in our presumed perfection that everything bad came from. So perfectibility turns out to be the cause of a few good things and many bad things. So it is, I'll go back to Karen's word. It's a paradox to use the word perfectibility to describe the source of many bad things. The other thing is the picture at the beginning, right? The picture of the Hottentot. She goes back to his equals. I think most readers opening up the book in the 18th century, seeing a bunch of Dutchmen standing, looking quizzically at a Hottentot headed back to some huts, would think, yeah, he goes from his superiors to his equals. But of course, the discussion of the Hottentot, which occurs in the note to natural goodness, in the note to nascent society, the best and happiest condition for mankind turns that expectation on its head. So I would say, in a way, the Aristotle remark expresses a partial agreement with Aristotle, but also creates an expectation that Rousseau turns on its head in the discourse. This is again part of the paratextuality that Chris brought up, right? He makes use of every device. He invents new words and then makes them mean something that's very different from what you expect they're going to mean. He uses these quotations. He relies on authorities that he then disagrees with, and so on. He's very adept at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I please invite Mary to ask the next question?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my internet connection is not really great. Thank you so much, Christopher, for that talk. I'm definitely not an expert or familiar with Rousseau, so I found the talk very clarifying. I'm not sure how relevant my question is, or if my question is too broad, so feel free to disregard if it's not relevant or there's not enough time. I was just wondering if you could speak to the concept of the noble savage, which is so often attributed to this piece. But I'm not actually sure if it even has proper origins in this work.
Yeah, it's not a term Rousseau ever used in this work or anywhere else. And, you could, it is also one of those things, like the idea of a state of pure nature as opposed to pure state of nature, that can create a false impression. That the account of human beings in the pure state of nature, I think there are many things to be said about this being a condition to which the word goodness can apply. Goodness in two senses. One, life is good. And two, people are good in the sense that they don't actively pursue evil as an end. That's all. It's not good in the sense that they are Kantian moralists who follow the categorical imperative in their behavior toward each other. Rousseau says as the robust savage will not take food away from an infirm old man unless he doesn't hope to get his meal elsewhere, which means if he doesn't hope to get his meal elsewhere, he'll shove the guy down and take the food. Right? So robust and good are terms that describe human beings in the pure state of nature. Noble is not. That would be a misleading term. On the other hand, in nascent society, or the veritable youth of the world, where people live in societies together, but with customs, but no laws, their people are essentially concerned with their status. Rousseau presents this as the best and happiest state for human beings, but it's filled with bloodthirsty vengeances where people are disrespected. So a certain sort of concern for nobility is an appropriate term to use for that stage of the state of nature. But he doesn't use the term noble to describe it, perhaps because he describes it as so bloodthirsty. But still bloodthirsty, but fewer people getting killed than in one day of battle in any European war. So it's a good question, but again, I think Rousseau's failure to use the term that we today might be expecting him to use is helps us get to what his real argument is.
Many thanks indeed, Mary, for your question, and Christopher, again, for your answer. Just before we thank Christopher for the wonderful seminar and the rich discussion time that there was afterwards, can I just draw your attention to upcoming seminars in the Monash Social Contract Research Network seminar series. So our confirmed speakers for next semester are Barbara Arnail, who's of course written on Locke's social contract, and then a more recent book on what she calls domestic colonies. Ioannis Evrigenis, who was present today, John Protevi, and Philip Pettit. If you want more information about when those seminars will be, could I invite you to Google Monash Social Contract Research Network, and there's an email list you can sign up for if you would like to be kept in the loop about those upcoming seminars. So it just remains for me then to, on behalf of us all, thank Christopher Kelly very much indeed for taking us deep into Rousseau's State of Nature and for engaging so fully and charitably with all the questions. Please join me in thanking today's speaker, Christopher Kelly.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Chris. I've enjoyed this very much, and thank everyone for the questions.